everyone. Doesn't matter if they're Jewish, if they're Arab, if they're Israeli. They've treated people from all the Arab countries that have had to flee from Syria, among others. We support Hadassah Hospital because they have innovative medical research going on. You wouldn't believe what they have there if we could all pick up and move if we got sick. The treatments that they're coming up with for all diseases are incredible. And we also support youth programs there. Recently in Washington, D.C., we met with our state representatives and to advocate for a caring community here and in Israel. And tonight we're honored to have Judge Ed Emmett and Mr. Jeff Linder here to present, and hopefully we won't have floods anymore. From my mouth to God's ear.
Thanks, Lori. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm Rabbi Oren Hayon, a member of the clergy team here at Emmanuel. Very pleased that you're with us this evening for an opportunity to do some learning, to hear from some very significant and influential voices in our community, and also to have a chance to ask some questions. The format of tonight's presentation will be that each of our speakers will be presenting for 20 minutes or so, one after the other, and then after that we'll move into a period of Q&A. So we will be making our way through the seats. If you have a question or comment that you'd like to offer to our speakers, I hope that we'll have enough time for everybody to ask their questions or share their feedback. So if you want to take some notes now while we're listening so that you'll remember your questions when I come to you. I do want to also, in addition to welcoming all of you to Congregation Emmanuel, I want to be sure to offer my thanks to the Emma Lazarus chapter of Hadassah for their co-sponsorship, for their help in the logistics and organizations of this evening, and for their steadfast and devoted work to the cause of Zionism and to offering an important voice to amplify the message of Jewish women here and around the world. So my opportunity now is to introduce the first of our two speakers. It is a pleasure and a privilege for me to welcome Judge Ed Emmett to the Bema tonight. Judge Emmett has served as a Harris County judge since 2007, and along with the county commissioners has held ably a position of management here in the third largest county in our nation. By virtue of his position, Judge Emmett serves as the director of our county's Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management and serves as the chair of the Harris County Juvenile Board. He also serves as the chairman of the Conference of Urban Counties Policy Committee. Judge Emmett is a graduate of Bel Air High School and received an undergraduate degree from Rice University and a master's of public affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. A former member of the Texas House of Representatives, Judge Emmett has received numerous awards and honors during his accomplished career, including being recognized as a distinguished alumnus of Rice University, having received the Distinguished Public Service Award from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs, and the Presidential Call to Service Award. I am so pleased to have him joining us this evening. Please join me in welcoming Judge Emmett.
Thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for allowing me to be here tonight. Before anybody calls the fashion police on me, I came from another event where we were required to wear black and red, so that explains my black coat and red Valentine's tie. But it's the only thing I had. I want to really get to the Q&A as quickly as possible because that's the most interesting. But what we're really here to talk about tonight is before, during, and after Harvey. And we could spend a long time talking about that. So very quickly, the before Harvey, let's go to Allison. I wasn't county judge at the time, but the whole Rice University Medical Center area flooded. And a lot of people went, why? What was that? And Allison was a tropical storm. It wasn't a hurricane. Harvey was not a hurricane. It was a rain event for us. That's a hard thing to make people understand. But why did this area flood? Well, if you go back and you look at the maps before Rice and the Med Center were here, there was a big creek that ran right through this area. And as I'm fond of saying, Mother Nature has a long memory. And when the water got high enough, it went back to its natural flow pattern and went right through there. That's the bad news. The good news was, with improvements made to Braze, improvements made to the Med Center itself, and the very inconvenient improvements that were made to Kirby when they had it torn up for a long time to put the large drains underneath, those areas haven't flooded since, even during Harvey. So we know we can make it better. And then Allison, of course, was followed by Tax Day and Memorial Day floods. And I distinctly remember, because as you heard, I went to Bel Air High School. My wife went to Bel Air High School. Loop 610 had never gone underwater before. And suddenly we all went, wow, what's going on? And one of the first things we have to do is admit when we don't see something coming. Can't make excuses. You have to say, look, we didn't see that coming. And so it was a wake-up call. But then Harvey came too quickly for us to really do enough to deal with it. So here comes Harvey. And I'm going to leave a lot of that for Jeff Lindner. And see, are you introducing Jeff? Okay, well, you're not going to use the line that I would use. Because I don't know, was it the New Yorker or the New York Times that had the headline that said, "Move over, Beyonce, there's a new diva in town." And it was talking about Jeff Lindner. So I'm going to move over fairly quickly so that the diva can get up here. Because when we talk about communication, one of the most important things is having the right information and getting that information out to the public. And early on, as I came in as county judge, director of Homeland Security Emergency Management, that's something that each county has one person, because we have 34 cities. And we have 1.8 million people who live in unincorporated Harris County. So you can't have each mayor declaring an emergency and doing this. It has to be one person. But at the same time, it's important, if you think back to Ike, it's important that the public knows what's going on. And so when Bill White was mayor during Ike, I said, look, I've got the title, but people know what a mayor is. They don't know what a county judge is. I'm not even a lawyer. Y'all all understand that, I assume. No. County judge is a purely administrative position. I have no judicial functions, but yet the title is judge. I'm not a lawyer. I have no judicial functions. And I and the 4 county commissioners run the county, and we're referred to as the commissioner's court, but it's not a court. I wake up every day being a judge who's not a judge presiding over a court that's not a court. You wonder why I'm confused most of my life. But, so all of a sudden I was told, you're in charge of emergencies. And early on, and I'm not saying this just because he's here, but Jeff Lindner is really a world-class meteorologist, and he would brief somebody who would brief somebody else who would brief me. And it didn't take me long to say, well, why are we doing this? Why don't we just let Jeff tell the public what's going on from a meteorological point of view? And that's worked out a lot better. We try to simplify things. So when we talk about communications, we have to simplify things. Well, Harvey was approaching. And the timeline's going to be a little bit off. But I know Jeff and other people who worked in flood control started talking about this could be a really big rain event. 20, 24 inches. Big rain event. And then I think you said something like, in some of the areas west of us, they could get 50 inches of rain if this thing stalls. Well, we all know it didn't stall west of us. It stalled over us. We didn't know any sooner really than you did. I mean, maybe a matter of hours, because our job is to get that information out as quickly as possible. But we didn't know where the rain was going to fall. So when certain state officials went on television and said we should evacuate, that's ludicrous, because we would have had to have done that on Wednesday before the rain started on Saturday. And if I had gone on television and said, I want everybody to close their business and leave town on Wednesday, would you have done it? No, you wouldn't have. You just can't do that. So by Friday, when we realized the rain was really going to be heavy and severe, we had to start making decisions. And it's always a laugh line that's really not meant to. The first decision I had to make was whether or not to cancel the Coldplay concert in NRG Stadium Friday night. But you think about it, we'd had that earlier event where people were in Toyota Center downtown, turned absolutely tragic. We couldn't have tens of thousands of people out there. Fortunately, the band canceled, and so we didn't have to make that decision. But we knew it was going to get bad. And then when the rains finally started on Saturday, we still didn't know where it was going. And my first question, and it's because of my background, where all my family lives, was, how'd Meyerland do? And at first it did okay. So I went, well, thank goodness, at least Meyerland didn't get hit again. Well, Harvey corrected that the next day, as we all know. But it turns out that the entire county, and Jeff, I'm sure, has more statistics he can talk to you about, the entire county was inundated with, in the neighborhood of 50 inches of rain. So nobody could have seen that coming. But let's talk about what comes next. Because after we've gone through Ike, and by the way, thankfully we're through the hurricane season. I feel very sorry for the people in Florida. But there was a benefit there. It went a little bit east of where it could have gone. And if it had gone just a little bit west, then Panama City and some major population centers would have been wiped out. I take you back to Ike. Ike went right over the eastern edge of Galveston Island. If Ike had gone over the western edge of Galveston Island, we could have had thousands of people killed, because that storm surge would have gone again across the west end of Galveston rather than Bolivar. And we all saw what happened at Bolivar. So that's why I make these distinctions between hurricanes and rain events. Harvey was bad, but if a hurricane had come our way this year, I'm afraid people would have confused it, and people would have tried to evacuate from areas they didn't need to evacuate from, and instead some people would have stayed in harm's way. That they said, well, I didn't flood during Harvey, I'm going to stay. It would have been bad. So right after Harvey, I and the 4 county commissioners, and I guess I need to tell the story because it's important. When did my life change? I was in our Emergency Operations Center, and if you've never been, that's a good field trip to take. It's the largest, most technologically advanced in the country. It's a fabulous facility. But I was in there for 6 nights, and finally the skies cleared, and everybody was happy, and I drove home, and my daughter, who lives in Brays Heights, and she and her family had been taken out by boat. Fortunately, their home wasn't severely damaged. She had been back in, and she and a church group had some shoes, 1,000 pair of shoes, brand new, that they were going to give to people who had been mucking out their houses. And she asked if I would come over and say hello to those people and shake a few hands, and I said, sure. After I finished showering and changing clothes and I turned onto her street, that's when it all changed. Because what did I see? Nothing but piles of debris on both sides. And I was talking to our legislature was in special session. I was talking to our legislative person in Austin, and I said, you're going to have to give me a minute. I'm going to pull over and call you back. But when I pulled over, that's when it got worse for me, because there was an elderly couple that came walking out of the house on Aberdeen. And they went out to that debris pile, and they weren't carrying anything. They were searching through it. And it's at that point that I fully realized these are not piles of debris. These are people's lives. And we have to do something about it. So I and the 4 county commissioners started saying, we're not going to wait on the federal government. We're not going to wait on the state government. We know we're going to have federal matching funds or local matching funds for the federal dollars. So we started putting together this package, and it came up. Nobody had ever done $1 billion bond package, and I don't mean to be flip, but once you get past $1 billion, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. Voters, $1 billion, $2 billion, $3 billion, it's all runs together. But that's not enough. Let me be clear. We need about 10 times that amount ultimately. But in the meantime, we needed this bond issue. So when do we have the election? Everybody said, do it in November, do it in November, do it with the general election. And I was counter to that. I said, no, we need to do it standalone on its own so that the people who really care about this issue are going to be there to vote. And political scientists and others said, oh, no, it has a better chance of approval if you do it with the general election. Well, then it dawned on us that August 25th was the one-year anniversary, and it was a Saturday, and it seemed like a good day. Governor Abbott, to his credit, allowed us to have it then. We can't have elections any day we want. We have to do them on uniform election days. So we had it August 25th, and I assume since it passed by 86%, a lot of you voted for it, so thank you very much. And now we've got to figure out what are we going to do. We're going to have to deal with every watershed. We have 22 watersheds in Harris County. I always say 23, but I get corrected because Halls is part of Greens technically. But so we had the public hearings around, and where we are now is no matter what else happens. I mean, if you know anything about me, my passion is mental health. We talk about transportation, we talk about taxes, we talk about all those things. But the overriding issue facing Harris County going forward is resilience. We have got to be a resilient community. And then this bond issue was the first chance. The federal government, fortunately, they came up with a fair amount of money. And that money's going to start flowing. And I'm saving specific projects because I know you're going to have questions about those. We'll talk about those later. But now we have to go to the state. And I'm staying out of, it's not a partisan comment, but you know, the state has this thing called a rainy day fund. If Harvey wasn't a rainy day, then I don't know what is. It's got $12 billion in it. And it is specifically set aside for emergencies. So we need the state to step up and play their part. And this doesn't help Harris County, but I've encouraged the state to supply the local matching funds for all those counties that are smaller than us that don't have the wherewithal to do it. I think it's the right thing to do. So we have 237 projects. About 40 of them are underway. A lot of them will involve buyouts of properties, and that generates a lot of questions. The buyouts are voluntary at this point, but the reality is if you buy out an entire subdivision and you have 3 or 4 homes left in there, that doesn't make any sense. So I don't mind being blunt. I think we're going to have to go in and use eminent domain so that those areas can be turned into natural areas and retention ponds and everything else. Some of the buyouts are very simple. We bought out a subdivision on the lower reaches of San Jacinto River. I guess it's been 2 or 3 months ago now. The name of that subdivision was Sandbar Estates. Now, if you live in a subdivision named Sandbar Estates, what's your first clue? We've allowed people to build places where they shouldn't have built. We have to be willing to say that was wrong. Not try and defend it and not say, well, it was their fault or my fault. No, just say it was wrong and move on. When we talk about channelization, it's more than just expanding the flow, because take Braze. It's got 32 bridges over it. And we've got to go in and improve those bridges, because if you leave the columns in the water flow area, not only do the columns impede the flow, but then whenever you get the debris, it backs up against the columns and it makes it that much worse. There's been a lot of talk about Addicks and Barker. Addicks and Barker are not county facilities. Those are federal facilities. The good news is they have the money to start improving and getting those back to the area they are. I still get emails from people saying, they're not as polite as I'm going to be, saying that we were just really stupid for not releasing the water out of Addicks and Barker before the rains came. Do you know how much water is in Addicks and Barker? None. There is no water in them under natural, but people, mythology develops. There's this talk about the third reservoir. The third reservoir was designed to prevent the overflow from Cypress Creek from getting into Addicks and Barker. But when it was designed, basically nobody lived along Cypress Creek. Now we have about 300,000 people who live along Cypress, so that third reservoir needs to be more designed to keep the water out of Cypress in the first place. And it has to be designed now in such a way that we preserve the Katy Prairie, because back for many years nobody cared about the Katy Prairie except for the Katy Prairie Conservancy. But now a lot of us do, and that's another example where the state could turn that into a nature preserve and be done with it for really very little money. And so those are some of the projects. And then Harvey did $200 million worth of damage to our current flood control infrastructure. So when Channel 2 asked me a little while back, and I gave one of those answers that you go, that didn't sound right. They said, are we better prepared now than we were before Harvey? And I said, no, we're worse off. Well, people don't like to hear that, but in fact, that was the truth, because we hadn't made repairs to get us back to where we were before Harvey. So we need to be doing that. But then Harvey also created new problems. We can talk about the Army Corps of Engineers and their decision to release. Addicks and Barker were built back in the 40s. They were 20 miles out of town. Nobody was ever going to live there. Now, we've built all the way up to those dams, and inexplicably in some circumstances, built behind the dams. And you have to say, really? Did we do that? We did. And we shouldn't have. But the problem in all that building, I'm concluding by going back to where I began. Just like in the Rice Med Center area, when all that building occurred, nobody really kept track of where all the creeks and tributaries were. So that when Addicks was filling up and the water was beginning to go around the north end of the dam, the Corps had no idea where that water was going to go. So I have to be careful to stay out of any discussion, because there is a lawsuit, and fortunately I'm not part of it, but I don't want to be drawn into it. But the Corps made a decision to open those floodgates, knowing which areas were going to flood, as opposed to just allowing the water to be an uncontrolled release and having no idea which areas were going to flood. And on the north end of Harris County, the San Jacinto River Authority made a decision to open the floodgates on Lake Conroe. And that's what flooded Kingwood, which normally wouldn't have flooded. Forest Cove, some of the lower areas would, but parts of Kingwood flooded that are nowhere near. So the bottom line is simply this. We've got a lot of work to do. We've got to know which areas are most in danger. We've got to redo all of our floodplain maps with FEMA, because, and feel free to correct my numbers, Jeff, if I'm not exactly right, but roughly 160,000 homes flooded in Harris County, and over 100,000 of them technically were not in a floodplain, didn't have to have floodplain insurance. Well, they were in floodplains, and they should have had insurance, but they didn't know it. Well, that's bad on all of us, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So as far as Harris County and the flood control district is concerned, we know we're going to get more rain. Hopefully we won't get another Harvey, because it was evidently the rain of all time for North America. But still, we have a lot of areas that are going to flood if we get 20 inches or 12 inches in some cases. So we need to move forward, and that's why I wanted to be here tonight. So I think I've used up my 20, and then I look forward to the Q&A, because that's the reason the bond passed. Was we had those public engagement meetings, and you didn't get a lot of speeches from elected officials. You got to meet with the flood control people and others who actually had the maps and could talk to you about what was going on in your neighborhood. I'll leave you with one bit of humor. When we were doing the bond election, it made me feel a lot better. We ran tests or surveys approve or disapprove, and we put all kinds of political figures and others on there to see who might we use. So for fun, we threw another name on, Jose Altuve. 6% of the people disapprove of Jose Altuve. How could anybody disapprove of Jose Altuve? So that makes me feel good every morning when people write me hostile emails. I go, well, maybe you're that 6%. But I can't say enough about the public's reaction. The public was angry. Public is probably still angry in many circumstances, as they have every right to be. And so we've all got to make sure that we say, okay, we can keep griping or we can start working on it. And we started working on it, and that bond issue, like I said, we've already put millions of dollars out. Knowing the money is going to come, we can count on it, and we look forward to moving forward. So I appreciate being here tonight, and I look forward to your Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Judge. It's a pleasure for me to introduce our next speaker this evening. I know he probably feels some ambivalence about the fact that his reputation achieved a new level after something like Harvey, but we can't deny that Jeff Lindner's local and even national reputation achieved a new level of recognition and appreciation because of his work during and after Harvey. His voice was reassuring to many of us, both here in town and really across the country, who followed his updates on Twitter and his news conferences about as the water levels continued to rise across the greater Houston metropolitan area. I'll tell you a bit about his background. He was a 2003 graduate with a degree in meteorology from Texas A&M University. He began working at the Harris County Flood Control District as an intern back in 2003 before he came on full-time a year later. And since that time, he's risen to the ranks of serving as Harris County's chief meteorologist. Before he takes the microphone, I will just say that will be delighted to go home and tell my daughters tonight that I was the opening act for someone bigger than Beyonce. I'm very pleased to welcome to the Bema Jeff Lindner.
All right, good evening. So yeah, I'm the meteorologist. I'm not an engineer, so I do not construct flood control projects. I went to school for meteorology, and I learned hydrology in Harris County. And hydrology in Harris County is complex. And I'll echo some of what Judge Emmett said here in a few minutes to make sure those points get driven home. But let's go back to Harvey for a minute. Harvey moved across the Caribbean as a tropical storm, then it degenerated into tropical wave, moved across the Yucatan, moved into the southern Gulf of Mexico, went from a tropical depression to a Category 4 hurricane in 42 hours. Made landfall at Rockport with sustained winds of 130 miles an hour. But we didn't have a hurricane in Houston. We had a rain event. A lot of people prepared for a hurricane. They heard the word hurricane. We drive into people's heads around here. When you hear the word hurricane, this is what you do. You get food, you prepare for your power to be out, prepare for your roof to be blown off, you cover your windows, you get ready to be on your own for 3, 5, 7 days. And that's what you did because you heard the word hurricane. And the good news is those preparations paid off when either your house flooded in some cases and you had the supplies you needed, or in some cases the residents that didn't flood that were trapped in their homes for 3 and 4 days. A very beneficial part of Harvey was that we had power the whole time. We had a very good line of communication from sitting at Transtar to you at home. Something we did not have during Ike, when Ike took down 98% of the power in this region. And that's going to happen again. And so one thing we have to understand is every storm is different. Every hurricane is different. Every tropical storm is different. Every rainfall event is different. For those of you that are in the Meyerland area, you went through Memorial Day 15. 11 inches of rain in 3 hours on Brays Bayou up around Beltway 8, Highway 59. Almost a foot of rain in 3 hours. There's very few drainage systems that can handle that quantity, volume of water in such a short period of time. A year later, you would be impacted by the tax day storm. And the rainfall wasn't quite as much. The water levels didn't get as high, but homes did flood. And a year after that, you would go through one of the worst events most of you have ever faced, that this city's ever faced, that this nation's ever faced. Over 4 days, we had 1 trillion gallons of water fall in this county. We had 70% of our entire year's rainfall in 4 days. We approached, in some areas, 60 and 70% of what we physically thought could fall out of the sky in 4 days. And most of Bray's Bayou had between about 25 and 35 inches of rain. But yet it rained 60.5 inches in Jefferson County over in Beaumont, Port Arthur. That's the maximum total from Harvey. So can you imagine, because I'm going to ask you to go back to the days before Harvey, and could you have imagined on Thursday and Friday before Harvey what 3 and 4 feet of rain looked like? We couldn't have. Most of us couldn't have. We all knew there was going to be flooding. We all thought maybe this would be like Tropical Storm Allison, or maybe this would be like Memorial Day, or maybe this would be like Tax Day. But we couldn't fathom that it would be all of the county, in every single county around us, and every river from the Sabine all the way down to the Colorado, all being impacted at the same time. And so I ask you, knowing that you have between 25 and 35 inches of rain, can you imagine getting 60? Double what you had. 2 Harveys. Because it happened. Not very far from here. I think one thing that we look at, we talk about Harvey, and Harvey has, in some ways, really changed us. Unlike any other storm, I say like any other storm going all the way back to 1900. There has not been such a resolve from the community to do something about flooding in this case since once we saw back in 1900 in Galveston Island, where they raised an entire city and built a seawall. And all of that went with that. And if anybody's read any of the stories, you know it went with it. But we have this resolve right now to do something about our flooding. And one thing I think we have to understand is that Harvey is a really big storm. 25, 35, 45 inches of rain is a lot of water. We can flood from a lot less rainfall than that. And the fact is, we're never going to build for a Harvey. We can, but it would be so expensive that the funding is just, we're not going to be able to build that. And so one thing we're going to have to do is we have to accept, in some cases, that our natural hazard here is flooding. A lot of people move here from other parts of the country, especially the northern parts of the United States, where they do not get hurricanes, they do not get rain at the rate we get rain. And this is all new. And they don't understand our floods. They don't understand it can rain 7 inches an hour down here. Most of our underground drainage systems can handle 2 inches of rain an hour. Our streets are purposely cut below grade to hold the water in the streets when the underground drains are overwhelmed. And the hope is that the rain stops before it gets into some of the homes. But occasionally that will happen. And that brings us to floodplains. And the one thing I'm going to say about floodplains, I'm going to start with the statement, we are all in a floodplain. Because we have put a lot of reliance on lines drawn on a map, and if you're in, that's bad, and if you're out, I'm never going to flood. And that is not how this works. Floodplains are just rates. They determine how much you pay for your flood insurance. Those areas inside the floodplain pay a higher rate. Those areas outside pay a lower rate. But all of us have a flood risk. Every single one of us has a flood risk. We can flood. In 1979, in Alvin, Texas, it rained 43 inches of rain in 24 hours. Tropical Storm Claudette. That is almost all of Harvey's water in one day, not 4. I promise you, if it rains 43 inches of rain at your house, you are going to flood. You will flood, regardless if you're in a floodplain or not. And so we've got to start looking at this as we all have a flood risk here. A lot of our flood risk, sometimes over half of the homes that flood from these street drainage systems. Because there's only so much water you can stuff down a pipe in a period of time. And you can't just put in bigger pipes and move the water quicker to the bayou, because then the bayou is going to flood even worse. But flood insurance will help in the event that that happens in your area. And a lot of this is areas inside of the loop or inside of the beltway that are older subdivisions that had drainage put in back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the pipes are even smaller than some of the newer drainage going in areas outside Harris and further out in Harris County. Of the 160,000 homes, and that's just homes, that flooded in Harris County for Harvey, which is 2 times the amount of homes that flooded for Tropical Storm Allison, which when we went through Tropical Storm Allison, most of us thought this is the worst thing we've ever faced and probably ever will. 36% had flood insurance. 36%. The average payout to a homeowner who had flood insurance for Harvey was $120,000. The average payout for a homeowner who did not have flood insurance that got individual assistance from FEMA was $4,000 to $7,000. That's the statistic I need you to take back and tell everybody. Because if you do not have flood insurance, it is financially devastating to go through this stuff. One thing I'll say is, to close up, Harvey, well, I guess I'll talk a little bit about communication. We knew Harvey was going to impact us. We had a very concise communication effort to try to focus this area on the flood part of this, not the hurricane or the storm surge part, because hurricanes are 3-pronged hazards. You got the rain, the wind, and the coastal storm surge. And so we were very concise leading up, talking about the rain. And one of the things we do very well in this area is work with our TV meteorologists, with the National Weather Service, with the emergency managers, so that we are all speaking with the same voice. We are all talking together. So you are getting consistent messages. Because we learned that from Hurricane Rita. When there was mixed messages about who should evacuate, when you should evacuate. And we saw what happens when you do not have consistent messaging. And so we worked very hard to make sure we're all saying the same thing. That gives you confidence that what we're saying, that you should act on, that you should take that action. One thing I'll end with, because I think we have to, is we've talked a lot about flooding in the last 14 months. We've been through probably one of the worst 3-year periods in the history of our city. And we've had big floods before. 1935, the creation of the flood control district resulted in the building of Addicks and Barker dams. And let me just throw a stat in there real quick. The water level in December of all months of 1935, December, a wintertime flood, went to 52.1 feet at Shepherd Drive on Buffalo Bayou. The water level for Harvey, which was less rainfall than December 1935, went to 42 feet at Shepherd Drive, 10 feet lower, for almost 10 inches more of rainfall. So Addicks and Barker, even though they were overwhelmed, even though releases had to be made, even though the North End Spillway was engaged, reduced the water surface elevation downstream on Buffalo Bayou by about 10 feet. And it probably would have been higher than 52 feet because we had more rain during Harvey than we did in 1935. One thing I'm going to ask is that we've had Michael, the third strongest hurricane to ever strike the United States since 1851, stronger than Andrew, stronger than Katrina. Only two other hurricanes have been stronger. Hurricane Camille in 1969, which struck Mississippi, and the 1935 Florida Keys hurricane. And you've seen the images of what 150-mile-per-hour winds will do. And the question I have, and that I've been ending a lot of my talks with, is we had a very hard time imagining what 3 and 4 feet of rain would do. Can you imagine what 150-mile-per-hour winds will do to this city? Because most of us have never experienced anything close to that. So that's my positive note I like to end on.
Thank you for that sunny vision of the future, Jeff. I appreciate the optimism. And I'm going to invite Judge Emmett to take a seat up here. Also, we have a microphone, I guess, in the back. So as you have your questions, we can make sure that everybody in the room can hear the questions for our panelists to respond to. I see one right here in the middle. So, Gary, you have a mic coming your way.
Right. The bond issue, like I said, it had 237 projects. That's not one of the projects that's on there. So the whole discussion of buying Westwood or Brayburn was also mentioned. That's not even on the drawing board right now. So the 237 projects are it. That's why I started by saying we're talking about $2.5 billion, but it's going to take a lot more than that to actually make it work. And on a side note about Westwood, I really wish, I'm not sure how to say this. You know, Westwood was just rebuilt not that long ago. And if we had gotten to it a little bit earlier, then maybe they wouldn't have rebuilt it and we could have done a better deal. But right now there is no money to buy anything like that.
Right now you're doing a lot of digging around Brays Bayou. And my understanding is it's doing to lower the base flood elevation. Are the people who are raising their houses wasting their money?
I don't think so. Because as Jeff said, you're still going to flood. And now I'm going to get off a little bit. Part of the problem, and I always forget whether it was Memorial Day or Tax Day, in one of those, Brays Bayou came out of its banks. In the other one, it didn't. The other one, the flooding was mainly the streets, the city drainage system couldn't handle it and even get it into the bayou. So the improvements we make on the bayou will help on some cases, but in other cases they won't. And so it's going to be an individual decision, but I would say no, for peace of mind and for long-term security, raising the homes is still a good idea. Did you want to add? Yeah. Okay. We may as well both just stand.
Hello, Judge Emmett.
I think Jeff wanted to make a comment about that.
I mean, yeah, one thing we have to always remember when we're talking about mitigation is there's always potentially a storm out there that exceeds your mitigation. And so it goes back to how high, how much money are you willing to pay to mitigate against a risk? And, you know, it's the same thing if you're looking at wind with windows. Do you put in impact-resistant windows? Do you put up boards? Do you put up shutters? Each one of those are a different level. And so it's the same thing with elevating homes. You're reducing your risk of flooding, but you're not eliminating the risk. And that's always something to keep in mind. Even when we do projects, for example, on Brays, we are reducing, it's a flood damage reduction project. It's not flood damage elimination.
Hi, Judge Emmett. My subdivision is Inverness Forest, and that's in an unincorporated area. It's north of Houston. And we have an earthen levee, and that was built because of Cypress Creek. That was built right around 1990. And that levee basically saved our bacon, during Harvey. But the reality of it was that we had 3 evacuation orders. The first one was voluntary, the last 2 were mandatory. And the reality really sunk in when I walked out my front door, and at the end of my block, at the stop sign, is the Cajun Navy. They were waiting to deploy if the levee was going to fail, because for a while they thought there was some erosion down by the catch basin, but it took 3 days of nonstop work to repair it. Other subdivisions in our area never had a levee, never had one built, and they flooded badly. So a levee does help.
A levee does help, and in fact, this is going to be kind of like a presidential debate. You know, you can ask whatever question you want, but then I'm going to answer the one I wanted you to ask. Because you mentioned something that I have to point out to every audience every time. Harris County is different than any other county in the country. We have 1.8 million people who live in unincorporated Harris County. County government doesn't even have ordinance making authority. That came up this week, and I'm not trying to get off into salacious things here, but at Commissioner's Court, when the city banned the sex robots, guess what? They come to the county. It's just the way it works. Dallas County has about 6,000 people who live in unincorporated Dallas County. And it's a quirk that goes back to 1963 when the city of Houston did strip annexations out all the highways. It put the whole county into the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the city, and in anticipation that they would annex in a logical fashion, and it never happened. And it's not going to happen now, because now the legislature's made it even harder for the city to annex. So we've got to come up with a way that we can do more. We have over 1,000 municipal utility districts in Harris County, each with their elected board. Some of them say they have flood mitigation powers, some of them don't. Some have road building powers, some of them don't. We have an urban governance problem here that this is just one example of that we're going to have to deal with. But back to your question about levees, there are other areas of town that are very similar that levees are going to be the answer of the flood control project that they need, because that's the only way to protect them. Do you want to say anything about levees?
What I'm going to say is that was the hardest decision I had to make during Harvey, was calling for the evacuation of that subdivision for Inverness Forest. We also have another levee in Harris County, the Northgate levee, which is just south of the Woodlands, where I-45 and the Hardy Toll Road come together. We have 21 levees in Fort Bend County that protect against the Brazos River. And no levees were overtopped by Harvey, which was very surprising. One levee failed in Brazoria County. Inverness came very close, very close. And what I'll say about levees is they are fine until they protect you. But as we saw in New Orleans, and just like we mentioned here, there is that storm that can exceed their design. And the potential for loss of life behind a levee is much greater than if the levee's not there, because it is a catastrophic potential failure. It's a wall of water that can come into a subdivision, and the water gets very, very deep. You're talking rooftop level flooding. And so you just have to be careful with levees. You just got to be careful.
How is your planning taking into account the impact of climate change on the severity and frequency of hurricanes?
All right, so let's talk about climate change for a minute. If you look back at what we've went through in the last 3 years, it's easy to say something's happening. I've lived here all my life. I've never seen storms of this magnitude. 15 and 16, you can really look and point the finger, and there's very strong correlation to El Nino in the central eastern Pacific. When we have El Nino, Texas is very, very wet. And it wasn't just Houston and southeast Texas. We had the Wimberley, the Blanco River disaster in 15. We had horrible flooding in North Texas and the Red River. We had flooding up in the Palestine area that cost 8 lives in one night. And so really there's a strong correlation between what sometimes happens in the water temperatures in the Pacific and how much it rains here in Texas. If you look at La Nina, that was when we had one of the strongest La Ninas on record. We had the 2011 drought, one of the worst droughts we've ever had. And then Harvey, and Harvey happened. And we have had worse hurricanes hit this state before. And there will be a day where we will have a hurricane worse than Harvey. It may not rain as much, it may not linger, but we can have very bad hurricanes here. And so what I'll say is there's very little denial that the earth is warming. That's pretty much a fact. Now, the cause to it, why it's happening, is it man-made warming? Is it the natural cycle of the earth? Is it a combination of both? That's where the debate starts to come in, and how we should try to work on preventing continued warming of the earth. But as far as it goes to give me some type of tangible, and this is an engineer speaking, to a climatologist that's trying to forecast what's going to happen in 100 years. The engineer says, give me something that I can build to. So if you tell me the rainfall is going to increase 50% in the next 100 years, is that 50% over the year, over what we normally get in a year? Because if that's the case, that's not where we get our flooding from. Where we get our flooding from is when it rains a whole bunch of rain in a short period of time. And so the question then becomes, is there an increase in intense short duration rainfalls that results in a lot of our flooding? And then how do we build to that? And what should we build to? What is it? What is it that we build to? What's the number? And what I like to say is the climatologists and the scientists and the engineers are talking past each other. They're not talking to each other. Because the climatologists will say, well, there's a 15% increase in hurricane rainfall. Okay, what's hurricane rainfall? Is it 10 inches? Is it 15 inches? And you give me a number, you add 15% to it, and that gives me a number I can build to. Because the engineer says, I need a number to build to, that I know what to build to. And NOAA Atlas 14 has come out. I'm sure y'all have heard about that. That's the new rainfall study for the state of Texas. That is going to increase our 100-year, 1% storm event for Harris County to about 17 inches. Right now it's 13.2. So if it rains 13.2 inches of rain at your house in 24 hours, that's a 100-year rainfall at your house. And that's going to go up to about 17 inches. We've been building to that 13.2 inch standard for the past 20 years, ever since Tropical Storm Allison. And to try to build to something that's 4 inches more than what we've been building to is going to be a challenge. That's a lot. You have to have that much more detention. You have to have that much bigger channels. So that's my kind of comment on the climate change.
Very briefly, to deny that things are changing is, just silly. I mean, satellite photos don't lie. If you've been to Glacier Park, you've seen where the glaciers were 10 years ago, 20 years. If you've been to Alaska, things are changing. From a policy point of view, it really doesn't matter. From a policy point of view, we know certain things we need to do to improve our lot. Number one, don't let anybody build in a floodway, actually in an area that is in a floodway. Preserve as much natural green space as we can. In an area like the Katy Prairie, for example, where it's a natural sponge, keep it. Those are just logical things to do, and we need to make sure we keep doing those. And we'll leave it to the engineers and the climatologists. But speaking of engineers, since Jeff scared you, I'm going to scare you a little more about the wind. There are people living out near Katy that are in houses that do not have the proper roof attachments. And if they get a wind, it won't even take 150 mile an hour wind. Fortunately, we're 50 miles inland, but we're not sure what winds those houses can take. So it puts people like me in a real awkward situation, because a hurricane comes, I tell those people to stay where they are. They're not in danger of storm surge. But now I've got to start calculating, well, if the wind gets above a certain amount, then I've got to get them to evacuate too, because the roof comes off your house, you got a real problem. So all those things are going to come into play.
First, an observation, Judge Emmett. I look at you and I see young Ted Koppel. I see a very strong resemblance. He is a hero. Okay.
Thank you, I think.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, this article in Sunday's paper. The point by two very fine argumenters, Sylvester Turner and Judge Ed Emmett. I didn't understand the counterpoint. Could you give me 3 reasons why this does not make sense? And that's an article by Bill King, and I really do not understand his logic.
Okay. Do you want me to talk about? Yep, Proposition A is what we're talking about, the Rebuild Houston. It doesn't do us any good for the Harris County Flood Control District to make vast improvements in the major bios and other flood control structures if the city drainage system can't get the water to them. That's what I said earlier. When Rebuild Houston was first created under Mayor Parker, that's when the drainage fee, the rain tax, whatever you want to call it, came in. A lot of people weren't happy about it because it was supposed to go to drainage improvements only. So some people sued, but they didn't get what they wanted out of the court, because the court said, well, the tax is fair, or the tax is legal, but the language specifying where it has to go needs to be rewritten. Proposition A, and this is the irony, and I've had this conversation with Bill King, Proposition A, if it fails, the tax is still going to be there, and the city can spend it on whatever they want to. So if you vote for Proposition A, it at least says it has to be spent on drainage improvements. One of Bill's arguments is, well, but it's going to streets and other things. Well, streets are part of the drainage system in the city, whether we like it or not. That it was designed that way. So there's a lot of confusion about Proposition A. A lot of people say you got to vote against it. And what Bill King said, I will give him this amount of credit. He says, yes, but 100% of it should be designated for drainage. Well, if Proposition A fails, that's it. Then none of it has to go to drainage. So you have to decide, do you take the practical versus the perfect? And that's, I think, what that was all about.
See if we can do one more. We have a swivel mic over here.
So I'm sorry, but I have like 3 things. Number 1, let me say them all and then you can respond. So number 1, there's a drainage project at Fornes and 610. And I don't know if you're familiar with it, but my big fear is all that water is going to go to Brays Bayou, and then when we flood, it's just going to be higher. And I don't know if you're the right person to talk to that or not. Number 2, what happens when there's a Category 5 hurricane that's potentially going to hit Galveston? What's going to happen in Houston, and we can't evacuate, right? So what's the plan? And 3rd, my husband, and this is just an idea, you could lobby for, with the federal government, we're dependent on this flood insurance. We all need this, and we worry that it's going to go away. Why can't the government mandate anyone that has a federally backed mortgage has to have flood insurance anywhere in the United States?
Okay, the 3rd one I'm going to duck completely. Just because I don't know what to say about it. The question about water going into Brays from whatever this drainage project is, of course, that happened with Kirby, too. when the big drainage improvements were made there. Prior to one of the storms, I remember getting a phone call from people in McGregor Park area, and I'm trying to make this short. I used to teach tennis at McGregor Park, so they knew me and they felt like I'm going to call personally. They were terrified that all the improvements had been made to save the Med Center and Rice after Allison, and that all that water was going to come down and flood them. It didn't. It flooded Meyerland instead. McGregor Park was just fine. So when Jeff said he's learned to be a hydrologist, I haven't yet. Trying to figure out how that works, we really have to trust the flood control district to understand that, whether that project, and I'm sure that that project is somehow tied to us, but we do have to get more water into Braze, and then we have to expand Braze so that it can carry it out. And your second question was about, oh, that's really a very good question. That's a very good question to end on. And Jeff can have the final word on it after I talk about it. Even though I'm county judge for Harris County, in a way I'm responsible for Galveston, Brazoria, because we have to let them clear before we put our people on the road. Our evacuation plans work. We have to know who to evacuate. And hurricanes are easy. I never thought I'd find myself saying this. A hurricane, you calculate the storm surge. You say these are the areas that are going to be inundated by the storm surge. You get them you tell them to evacuate. Everybody else, you say stay off the roads, because that was the lesson learned during Rita, when a lot of people got on the road that should not evacuate. And Ike worked fine. You know, people, quote, hunkered down. I'll never live that down. But, you know, they stayed, and that's what we have to do. The Cat 5, that's why I mentioned the wind, because if we do get something like that, then we've got to calculate, okay, how do we evacuate? Because then you can't let people take their own route. We need people on the coastal areas to go east, and if we need to evacuate the plains out along Katy, we need them to go west. But here's my final worry, since Jeff hit you with a bad one. Harvey and Michael had one great similarity. They spun up very quickly. And that's the change that I've seen, where these things pop up. And I was talking to the Nueces County judge, Corpus Christi. You know, they just had a tropical storm. They were not prepared to evacuate at all, and by the time it ginned up to a Cat 4, it was too late. So now we have to make that decision early. Even though it's just a tropical storm, I'm going to have to look at him and go, does this have the potential of becoming a Cat 3, 4, 5 hurricane? And if it does, we're going to have to call for an evacuation. And that's when people get mad. They evacuate for no reason. And we saw that with Ike. Mayor Lyda Ann Thomas in Galveston didn't want to evacuate because she had had a false alarm earlier in the year. And it took Bill White using some extremely colorful language at 5 o'clock in the morning to convince her that she had to get her people on the road, because we couldn't put ours on until Galveston cleared. So that's my worry, is that not the strength of storms, but the fact that they can change so quickly that we have to make decisions based on what might happen.
Yeah, and I'll echo a little bit of that. The killer in a hurricane is water. It's either seawater or it's fresh water. Very few people die from the wind. Even Hurricane Andrew, South Florida, 1992, Cat 5 hurricane, only 24 people were killed by the wind. And that's a major metro area that went into. And so, generally speaking, the wind is not the killer. We focus on it. We focus on those categories, 1 through 5. And what I said, I'll echo again at the beginning, every single storm is different. A Category 4 moving very fast is going to be very, very bad. It's going to bring those damaging winds way inland. We're talking Waco, Huntsville, Lufkin. A Category 4 moving like Harvey, you're only going to bring those hurricane force winds 15, 20 miles out, 20 miles, 30 miles inland, because it's going to weaken because it's not moving very quick. So every storm's different, and I don't want you to think it's only a Category 5. Most of you went through Hurricane Alicia, 1983. That was a borderline Category 3, between 2 and a 3. You saw the damage it produced. A lot of tree damage. Evacuation is for those coastal storm surge areas. Those are the areas you see on Bolivar. You go over to Holly Beach, Louisiana after Rita, not a single home left. You go to Pass Christian, Mississippi after Katrina. You go to Mexico Beach, Florida after Michael. There's nothing left. You will not survive on the coast. And so we have got to get those people out. And they have got to listen, and they have got to leave. Because that's another part of the equation. We can say till we're blue in the face, you've got to go. But people have got to leave. And then how do we deal with the inland population? How do we get the inland population to shelter in place, to hunker down, as we saw with Ike? And then in the event that we have to do a post-storm evacuation, because we do not have the resources here to sustain us. And when you're talking about something like Michael, you have nothing. But the simple point is, we can't all leave at the same time. 4.7 million people cannot evacuate down these freeways at the same time. We tried it with Rita. Even with contraflow, we just can't put that many people down these freeways.
Let me close with a couple words of acknowledgement. As both of our speakers have acknowledged tonight, both before, during, and after an event like Harvey, maybe the most precious commodity that we have is information. And to know that we have folks in elected office and folks working on our behalf who will offer us clear and candid and frank and timely information, even at the times when that information is sobering and scary, to me, I find to be a great comfort to know that we can rely on the word of the people who lead us and the people who are sharing and disseminating information. Means that even when the stuff that they're sharing frightens us, it is a comfort to know that we can rely on the things that they're saying. So I just want to add my thanks to, I know, all of your gratitude for the honesty and the candor, for the forthright information, even when it's not the words that we always want to hear from our speakers tonight. I'm very grateful that they shared their time and their expertise and their perspective with us. I am also grateful to our friends at Emma Lazarus Hadassah for having helped co-sponsor this evening, and very thankful to all of you for joining us this evening. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.